Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone. Ko Kate Barlow tōku ingoa. I am the Communications and Content Manager here at EECA. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this live webinar today. Today we're here to dive into New Zealanders' attitudes and behaviours towards energy and climate change. We are planning to start close to 11 and I think we've got a good number of people here now. So I'd like to hand over to our Group Manager of Marketing and Communications who will kick things off more formally. Joe, bye everyone.
Te hei Māori ora, ena mana, ena reo, ero rangatira mā, no mai, piki mai, haere mai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, my name is Jo Bai and it is my absolute pleasure to be welcoming you and hosting you to our inaugural Consumer Insight Webinar in which we are exploring how New Zealanders relate to climate change and energy use. If you're unfamiliar with EECA, our purpose here is to mobilise New Zealanders to be world leaders in clean and clever energy use. And given the fact that over 40% of New Zealand greenhouse gas emissions is energy related, it has increasingly become important for us to understand the direct correlation between energy use and climate change. And that has led us for the last 3.5 years to commission and conduct a line of research in this vein alongside our research partners at TRA. This wealth of information that we publish on a quarterly basis for our Consumer Monitor and in a half-yearly basis for our Business Monitor has directly fed into my particular team's responsibilities to do with education, public engagement, inspiration, storytelling, and ultimately to try and drive attitudinal and social behaviour change in this space. But this wealth of knowledge has also supported EECA's wider work programs, from informing and supporting our product and program design when it comes to the co-investment tools and levers that we create in order to support the decarbonisation of New Zealand businesses, transport solutions providers and the public sector, as well as our deeper and longer term strategic roadmap. However, to date, we've only ever looked at that data at a consolidated and aggregate level. And in the last 6 months, we've taken these steps to look under the hood and go one layer deeper and draw out what, basic demographics such as age and income, regionality, gender and cultural background, how they might influence how New Zealanders think, feel, prioritise and ultimately act when it comes to energy emissions and climate change. It's really important that we meet New Zealanders where their heads and hearts are in this space. And today, for the first time ever, we'll be sharing that data with you all. So we are grateful for how many of you are joining us for this session today. The reason why we are sharing this is obviously and logically this work will continue to inform EECA's work program behind the scenes. But we actually felt that the better opportunity and perhaps the bigger responsibility was to make this as widely available as possible so that it can help inform, be leveraged and enable other people's work programs. Yesterday was a great reminder with the latest IPCC report that we are in a very critical time when it comes to the climate change conversation. We need as much contribution as possible happening in parallel to push our country forward into a low carbon, climate resilient, renewable energy powered Aotearoa. And so for that, we are grateful for all of you being here today to help advance that. I'm about to hand over to my partner, Karen Glusina from TRA, who will take you through the findings. Presentation is going to take approximately 20 minutes. It is a summary of the rich data that sits underneath it that will be available on our website for you to look at in more detail later on today. We have got cameras on, we have got microphones off for attendees, and we are recording this session. We will have a live chat functionality, and we really encourage commenting, reactions, and of course submitting any questions with regards to the data that you are seeing during the presentation and any questions for EECA for us to answer at the end. We look forward to sharing this data with you. By all means, give us any feedback that you have post the session, and I'll hand it over to Cara now to take us through the findings.
Thanks everybody, kia ora tātou. I'm currently senior a partner here at TRA, and TRA, for those of you who don't know us, is an insight agency. It's actually great to see how many people we do know here that have been coming on, so please feel free, as Joe said, to put questions in the chat. We really welcome them. But what does TRA do? Well, I guess we combine our understanding of human behaviour, the what people do and the why people do it, with data science to help clients answer complex problems. And there isn't really a more complex problem than climate change. TRA have been partnering with EECA for nearly 4 years now on this work to help to understand how to really influence New Zealanders' behaviour. You know, and it's hard. Human beings are so bad at climate change or addressing climate change because we really haven't evolved beyond our flight or fight response. We're really good at dealing with current problems, you know, running from that tiger in front of us or fighting that fire that's threatening to engulf us. But give us a chronic problem or a problem in the future and we're not that good at dealing with them. We need help, we need nudges, things we can do today. We need little tigers to fight. And that's a lot of what today is about, giving little people little tigers to fight so we can give them actions to do and understand where they are. Now, if you want to influence behaviour, there's many things you need to know. There's triggers, there's barriers, there's motivations. You know, there's some really key tenets of behavioural change work that we work with. But one of the foundations is really who people are. Where are they coming from? And that's why we're going to be looking at demographic differences today as they relate to climate change. Things like age, gender, income, and all of these actually demographics have quite a big difference on how you relate to climate change. We are very fortunate. We've got an incredibly robust data set here. We've gathered it over the last 3.5 years. It's nationally representative of age, of ethnicity and region. It covers 9,000 New Zealanders aged 18 plus. And having this wealth of information allows us to dive into these subgroups. But also, really importantly, I kind of think a first for New Zealand in this, is it allows us to see how subgroups have tracked over time. Have people's attitudes or beliefs, you know, in certain age or ethnicities changed over time? So what we're going to do, we're going to look at people's beliefs. What do they believe in? You know, do they believe in climate change for a start? But then we're going to also look at their priorities. What do they prioritise, and where does climate change, you know, sit within all the many things that impact our life? And then also we'll look at actions. What are people actually doing? Because as we know, it's actions that make a difference. And actions can be individual or they can be collective. One of the things that we do know about motivating people on climate change is that they're really, really motivating by seeing others take action. The more we see others doing things, the more we want to do things ourselves. Okay, but let's get on to the data. We'll look at beliefs first. We've got a few people still coming in that lobby, so I'm hoping they're all going to be in shortly. I'm glad to see so much interest, I must say. Okay, so let's have a look at this chart here. This is the proportion of New Zealanders who believe climate change is real. So it's very high, an average of 82%, and it's very slowly but steadily tracking upwards. So what we can take from this, it's not our job to really convince people of the reality of climate change. And we don't really have to speak to people differently in this regard. Most people do believe. You might wonder about the other 20%. Who are they or what are they? We find that there's only about 6% of people who really don't believe in climate change, and there's another 14% who are sitting on the fence. But I guess what we think after all this time, if you're still sitting on the fence, we kind of don't count you as a believer. You'll also note, actually, and I'll talk about it when we look at priorities, there was a real dip, a significant dip. It was only about 2 points, but in our belief in climate change around January to March 2020. And that was really about the impact of COVID. We all of a sudden had this big tiger that was coming towards us, and we can only hang so many things in our heads at the same time. So our belief actually dipped for a few months there, but it recovered very quickly. So thinking about that context though, because we can only hold so many things in our head at one time, everything operates within a wider context. Climate change is what is known as a wicked problem, one with really complex interdependencies and changing requirements. But, it's not the only wicked problem out there. It sits with many other issues for New Zealanders. And a lot of these are closer to home for us at the moment. These are current tigers that are threatening us, and they make us not think sometimes about the future tiger. So New Zealanders prioritise climate change at number 14 out of 15 issues we measure. Quite low down the list when you think about it. And that's because it's not immediately affecting households like, some things like the cost of living or affordable housing. Most of these issues stay the same. They're, always on people's priority list. But one of the interesting things that we do see in our data over time is that when an issue gets a lot of media attention, like affordable housing or the cost of living, it very much raises up in people's priority list. So the more we can talk about climate change, the more it does raise it in people's priority lists. But that priority list is one of the reasons where we see the stark difference between these two numbers here. The 82% on the left who think climate change is real, and the 22% on the right who strongly agree that they're prepared to change their own personal behaviour in order to reduce climate change. A massive difference. This is a really vast difference, and this is kind of why we see that we're not making as much progress as we would like to. We may believe, we may be motivated, but our actions aren't in line with this. There's many, many day-to-day barriers. Our lives get in the way, financial pressures get in the way, time pressures get in the way. But another thing we know that does get in the way is just not knowing what to do. And thinking about back to that tiger and how we, flight or fight from that tiger, the closer the home we can bring actions, the better. The more we can give people little actions to do, the better it will be. Actions are important for many reasons. Sometimes it's really hard for us to see, the difference of our small actions. I drove less. Does that make a difference? Well, yes, it does. But we do know that the more action someone takes, the more likely they are to support system-level change, support collective action, and the more of their own actions that they'll take regularly. So this is why we measure actions like recycling. We know that, recycling isn't the most effective climate change action people that can take, but it does start people on the road to more actions. And often people do think it's the most effective thing we can do. There's lots of education we still need to do. We know also from this data and tracking it over time that we need people to take at least 6 types of actions before we start to get to very strong engagement on climate change. So I guess like all behaviour change, it's about forming habits, doing these actions regularly, and it's about seeing yourself as a person who does things for climate change. I take regular actions for climate change. This really helps. So I guess I'd encourage you all, and you're all in different roles in different organisations, to think about how we can all move people down the action list. What actions do you want to encourage people to take, and how can we link them to other actions? So we are very much a willing audience. This isn't our issue. Our will is not our issue. Our motivation or our belief is not our issue. We can talk to people the same way here, but everyone's got different lives and competing priorities for their attention. You've all here today have got competing priorities for your attention. And that's where we need to understand where people diverge. We have to understand really where climate change fits into people's lives. We have to meet them where they are rather than force them to come to us. One of the key tenets of behaviour change is really how do we make it as easy as possible for people? And that's what this is about. So what this data is going to show is that age, is that gender, where we live, our income, our cultural influences, all impact how we prioritise climate change and what we're prepared to do about it. Some of these differences are stark, and some of them you'll go, yeah, I kind of thought that, and some of them are not that big. Some of them I think are quite revelationary on, how people prioritise things. But it's useful to think about these differences because that's where we have to be tailored in our solutions. So let's look at age first. And not surprisingly, age is one of those factors where we do see large differences. It's very much not just age, it's a generational divide that we see here. Now, what you see on this next chart, let's have a look. it's very much that agreement, with climate change is real. This is the same number, that 81% you saw at the beginning. And you can see here that there's convergence over time. Baby boomers are not as far off in their belief that climate change is real as they once were. Those lines are all sort of trending down together, or trending, up together. But baby boomers are still 7 points behind in their belief to the 20 to 29-year-olds. That's quite a difference. We do know that climate change will impact these different generations differently. And it's true that the younger you are, the more impacts you're going to feel. But we would like everyone to be thinking it's the same. And where we see that this is particularly important is how they prioritise climate change. Of all the charts that you'll see today, I'll just wait till some of these guests are gone so you can really see this chart. This is the chart that fascinates me the most. Okay? It talks to age, but also generational issues. So climate change is number 5 for our 20 to 29-year-olds in priorities, but it's only number 14 for our 50-plussers. So it's just not as much as priority for older people. Oh, yes, I see that comment about not referring to 50-plussers, baby boomers. I'm Gen X too, so yeah, I'm sorry about that. But you can also see how the generations rank other issues, such as mental health versus healthcare. We different ages have different priorities. But you can see that the reality of climate change is going to hit harder with youth. They are, and that because of this, they're significantly more likely to change their own personal behaviour. The action profiles that we see on these two groups is quite different. Those in their 20s are significantly more likely than those in their 50s, or 50 plus, to reduce use of petrol and diesel cars, to take fewer flights, and to buy organic food. While those in their 50 plus are significantly more likely than those in their 20s to choose energy efficient lights, energy efficient appliances, and to limit their energy use at home. Still some good actions there, really good actions. But you can see that actions are not only determined by priorities, but also what you can do and your knowledge of what's effective. So it's really about meeting people where they are and what's going to motivate them. Another really interesting age factor here is that, youth itself is a very broad brush, just as 50 plus, I guess, is a very broad brush. We do see lower overall agreement that with climate change is real, and more kind of sitting on the fence among our 18 to 19-year-olds compared to those in their 20s. But they're still higher than average. So 18 to 19 is clearly a formative age for people. It's where they really start thinking about things. The other interesting thing about 18 to 9-year-olds is they're typically less sure which climate change actions will have an impact and what they can do in this space. I guess they've had less time to, really look at this. But what is really useful is they are ready for guidance and they're very self-aware. Just 36% of 18 to 9-year-olds think they're doing all they can. This is the lowest of any age group, and it compares to 60% across New Zealand as a whole. So it's a group that needs encouragement to how they can make a difference, as they're very prepared to make a difference. So, this is a key group for us. So what does all this tell us? Well, if we want to encourage action from youth, we can frame this broadly in the climate change space. They really understand that macro level of we need to take action. And they are more prepared to make sacrifices in order to protect the climate, personal sacrifices. But for older people, the sweeping generalisation, but very much borne up by the data, we have to frame climate change around actions around things that might be closer to home and have immediate benefits beyond just, saving the planet, I guess. Things like home efficiency is a really good example. So before we go to region and income, is there any questions, Kate, on those age stats?
Kia ora, Cara. There are actually a couple of really good questions here. So I'll start on the first one that came through from Bethany from Clemenger BBDO. And her question was, how much movement do you observe in the list of which issues are most important to people? Do these move up and down very quickly?
Yeah, not quickly, Bo, but we do see that they move priorities, from time to time. Like we really saw when COVID hit that the economy moved much more up into people's priorities. So yes, they do change. They're always, the high ones are always high, but they do slightly change in priority.
Thank you. We've got another one here from Danielle. Do you have stats on the correlation between the types of individual actions taken and the propensity to support system change?
Yes, we do. And we do know that the more actions people take, the more likely they are to support system level change. And that's why, you know, we can't stop people at one action. We have to keep encouraging more and more actions.
Great. And I think we've got time for one more quickly before we move on. This is more of a technical question. If you stratified the 50+ age group into, say, 50 to 70, might that make a difference to views, do you think? It's not necessarily that big or statistically significant, but the older you get, the less likely you are to take actions, or less likely you are to feel the impact, I guess, of future climate change as a rule. So good question, thanks. Thank you, Karen.
Okay, let's get on to region and income. They present different challenges, really, and they're sometimes at odds with what we might see presented as wider narratives around this urban-rural divide that sometimes gets played up. Now, as you can see here on this next chart, there's very little differences in your beliefs or priorities if you live in a rural or an urban environment. In fact, the big takeout from this chart is how similar the numbers are on both sides of it. There's absolutely really no difference, I think. Climate change is number 14 in both terms of priorities and a willingness to take action for both these groups. The only significant difference that we saw in terms of actions taken between these two groups is that those living rurally are a bit more likely to recycle regularly. And we know it's an entry point, but we know recycling isn't the big thing that has an impact on climate change. So this is not a divisive area, rural versus urban. But income is another matter, actually. What we see is that income is a much higher determinant of whether you believe in climate change than whether you live in a city or whether you live rurally. Apart from age, income is one of the most discriminating factors. So if you only remember one thing today, it's age and income. Well, that's two things to remember, sorry. The higher income, the higher you will prioritise climate change. But we also know that income can be a determinant of emissions, so we need to factor priorities alongside willingness to act and how much action people are taking. The action profiles of our lower income, under 60k, versus our higher income, over 120k, shows some key differences too. Lower earners are significantly more likely to report limiting flights, while high earners are significantly more likely to choose energy efficient lights, buy lower carbon footprint products, and to buy organic food. It is a lot about how much spare income you do have. And it also raises to me, quite an interesting equity issue about emissions and fair share of reductions. We won't solve that here today, but can we and should we expect more from higher emitters? So a more useful narrative than the rural-urban divide is how we encourage people with different income levels to take actions and where climate change sits among other priorities. So that was a quick trip through income and region, but is there any questions on that? Any questions from the group, Kate?
Yes, Karen, thank you. Is income related to level of education as well?
I think it would be. I don't have the data, but we do have the data somewhere on that, but I imagine it would be, yes.
Okay, great. And we also have a follow-up to Danielle's earlier question, which I think is a good one to address. Are you suggesting that taking more actions drives people's support levels for system change up? Or is it that people who are more attitudinally aligned with system change are likely to be doing more behaviours?
I guess there's always correlations, but what we do see is when people start to take more actions, they see that it's, I guess, easier, that it fits in with their lifestyle more, it's not such a sacrifice, and so they are more supportive of system change. So yes, it does, it does make a difference.
Great, thanks Karen. Let's keep moving.
On to gender. Gender is also very interesting, and I am going to risk being incredibly stereotypical here. I'm sorry, but the data is the data, so I'm reporting what the data says. This definitely does reinforce some stereotypes. So what we see, women are consistently more likely to believe than men that climate change is real. There's a 7-point difference here, which is actually the same as that difference we saw in the generational divide, but it's not something we talk about as often. This gap hasn't closed over the past 3 years at all. It's exactly the same as it was in 2019. The other thing is that men are also harder to galvanise into action in support of climate change. Okay? So more women than men are prepared to change their own behaviour to reduce climate change. They say they're prepared to change their behaviour. Okay? But conversely, men are more likely to think that they're already doing all they can. So there is a real gap here between, am I doing enough and am I prepared to do more? Men are also much more likely to say it's hard to reduce your environmental impact without reducing the quality of your life. And here we also see a real gender and age interplay going on. So it's particularly pronounced among younger men. 55% of men in their 20s believe it's hard to reduce your environmental impact without reducing your quality of life. And that compares to 40% of women in their 20s. So all of these things do correlate. Now I'm going to really risk being really stereotypical on this next chart. But I guess what I was talking about before about how do we meet people where they are. One of the ways we can meet people where they are is in their big choices. So one of the ways that we can hook men into action with climate change is through EVs. Okay? Men are more favourable to EVs, they have a more favourable opinion, they're more open to considering them, and they have higher ownership rates of EVs than women. And we know that transport, is one of our biggest emitters. So, this is a good thing, If that's how people want to do their actions for climate change, that's great. But coming back to the bigger picture, I guess, meeting people where they are. With men, it's about increasing the links between travel choices and climate impact because that increases their momentum. Women, on the other hand, really need reassurance that they can make a difference, We can do this by empowering them with the knowledge that what they are doing already is making a difference, and again, other small actions that continue to make a difference. So any questions on my stereotypical comments there? Any questions, Kate, from the group?
More commentary this time, Karen.
Funny.
Yeah. So let's keep moving through. We might have some for this at the end.
That's fine. Okay. So the last thing I really want to look at is cultural background. 3 years ago, we saw some divergence by ethnicity on whether climate change was real. And you can see how these lines again, just with their age ones, are moving closer to convergence at the end. So ethnicity is not really as much of a differentiator on whether you believe in climate change as it was 3 years ago. What is different, we believe, is whether your culture is more collective or more individually skewed, which, influences lots of things, not just your belief or your actions on climate change. Whether it be collective cultures or individual cultures is a key differentiator across countries and within ethnicities within countries. New Zealand Europeans rate consistently lower across all measures, actually, on preparedness to change and ability to make a personal difference to the environment. I think I don't know how we necessarily address that, but it's a very interesting finding. Age within ethnicity is also very revealing. Among Pacifica, younger generations are significantly more concerned about environmental issues than older generations. And while Māori, concern is stronger in the older 50-plus generation than those in their 20s. So it's kind of, I think, how do we use influences within specific cultural communities to really drive up climate change? These numbers are not exactly reflective, but we definitely saw similar trends in the vaccination where it was, younger Pacifica leading the charge and older Māori leading the charge. So, cultural differences and how cultures work are important to understand because they help us influence. But I want to end now with two key takeaways before we go on to questions. So the first one really is we are reasonably, very much so, united in our belief. This is not the main area we need to change behaviour. We don't need to continually convince people that climate change is real. If they're on board now, they're on board. If they're not on board now, they're probably not going to get on board. But if we want people to take actions then we really have to understand where they're coming from, what their lives are like, what their predispositions are, what their influences are, so that we can tailor actions to them accordingly, actions and messages really, and fit in with their priorities. Not everyone will be receptive to the same message or contain the same actions, and that's why tailoring is really critical. So thank you all for your questions and your comments throughout. I know that there's been a lot more in the chat than I've answered, and I'm going to hand over to Kate and Jo now, because I'm sure there'll be some more that are more relevant for them to answer.
Ka pai, Karen, thank you. That was fascinating. We do now have a little bit more time for questions, so do continue to keep popping them through. We have had a lot come through, and as Jo mentioned earlier, we're very happy as well to follow up after the webinar if you'd like to continue the conversation, so please do drop us a line. Yeah, we'd love to keep talking to you about this stuff. So let's kick things off. This is also actually a question from you here, Karen, and it is that earlier in the presentation there was a comment on high awareness but low willingness to take action. Is there an inversion in the high income bracket where many are motivated to take significant action?
I don't know the answer off the top of my head on that one, I'm sorry, Kate, but that's certainly something we can look in and get back to you on. It's a really interesting question.
It is, thank you. Another one here from James. Do we know what the actual footprints of income groups are? Higher incomes may care more, but actually emit more because of their lifestyles.
It's probably one for you, I think, Jo.
Yeah, carbon footprint. Tricky space. MFE obviously measure production-based carbon footprint. We also need to look at consumption carbon footprint. We don't have the data specifically at EECA that separates out or understands the differences between things like gender or income background, but it is something that we are very keen to build out more so that we can present it in a way that potentially is more understandable for everyday ordinary New Zealanders. Good question.
Thank you. Actually, Jo, I've got another one for you now that's just come through. It's from Micah. Have you considered communications channels to overlay with age in terms of encouraging action?
I think the beauty of using the last deep dive to understand more about these different demographics is for it to influence the way that we communicate and engage with different groupings. Climate change is still in, a fairly fresh stage of behaviour change or public engagement arena, and so to date the priority for us has been to do mass broadcasts, singular messaging to try and encourage awareness of the topic and the urgency in the topic. But as the space matures, and obviously knowing that there is not one single silver bullet or solution to climate change, we are going to need to increasingly get more segmented, more targeted, and tailor our messaging, because people's lives are different, people's barriers to adopting those actions are different, and consequently we're going to need solutions that are much more tailored. So generally, the answer to that question is yes. That's the reason why we are looking at this information, is to start getting more sophisticated, I guess, in how we approach it.
Thanks, Jo. Do we have any more in-depth detail around the EV questions? Behaviour change in the space is still a really big challenge.
Yes, we do have detail around that. We know what people's barriers are. We know, if those barriers, I guess, outweigh the benefits of EVs. And we actually know that over time, some groups have got much more positive to EVs than others. So that data will be all in the decks that are provided.
And just to follow up on that as well, while this was a specific one-off piece that we've done, and we'll probably look to do this kind of work annually, our consumer monitors, which run quarterly, our next one is actually due to be published only next week, and there's a wonderful deeper dive into transport-related attitudes and behaviours that I think will be really interesting. So look out for us publishing that probably next Thursday, the 10th of March.
Great, thanks, Jo. We've got one here from Jeremy. You talked about a pathway of actions that lead to a more effective impact on climate change, which for some might start with recycling. Do you have an idea of what that pathway looks like in terms of what actions precede the next? How do we tip people from one to the next?
Yes, Jeremy, we do actually have that pathway of actions. I can't recall it off the top of my head, but that data is all there. We know actually when people move to another and how many, and how that looks. So that can definitely be shared.
I think, and we're still really trying to uncover it. There will be generalizations of, easy steps like changing your LED light bulbs or recycling pathway, gateway kind of actions, down to the very end of flying less or not using your car. Those are far harder actions for us as New Zealanders to adopt because it's not that convenient. So we have general groupings, I guess, of actions that we know require more deliberate personal choice and potential sacrifice to the convenience. And, ongoing is going to be us sort of looking into that to get more detail and to understand the funnel effectively and see whether we can create kind of general funnel systems that could be really useful for us moving people through.
Great. I've got another one here from Robin. How were the top 6 actions, top 6 climate change tackling actions determined? Reducing the intake of meat and dairy is often considered to have a significant impact on climate change. So why didn't this make the list? It's a more technical question.
I actually think that is in the list, but I could be wrong. But I guess when we look at climate change too, we're looking through the lens of energy efficiency, because this is EECA work, so that we know that there's other actions that we may not always be measuring. But a lot of this work was preceded by qualitative work 4 years ago, when we really looked at the actions people were taking and how they viewed them. So it's, I guess, based on evidence as well.
Thanks, Karen. Another more technical question. How do we start with hypotheses around those variables for the study? Or are these the usual things that we look at?
Well, how do we start with hypotheses? I guess what I do is I would ask myself the question, is this real or not? Is this true or not? Is just as very much we did around rural, urban. We went, well, is there a difference rural, urban? Let's go and check it in the data. So I guess it's just the usual way of hypothesis generation and then checking. And the data there that we can do that.
One thing I'd add to that too, Karen, is that we have our standard consumer monitor questions and survey. And so we applied the demographic markers over the top of those existing questions to then see whether or not differences existed. And that's also what helped us get to those conclusions.
Great, thanks, Jo. So we've got one here about messaging and how important you think it is in order for key influencers to be united in their messaging about the issues that we've talked about today.
Well, I think possibly the more important thing, I definitely think we don't need to add confusion into the marketplace for consumers. That doesn't help anybody. On the point, though, that should messaging be united, it really depends on who the message is targeting. So the way that a message might be framed to one group might be a different way that would create mobilization or motivate them, overcome the barrier that's standing in front of them versus others. So I think we recognize that universal messaging is not always going to work. For example, EVs is a great space. For some, the fact that EVs have no emissions and are therefore will help climate change objectives might be motivating for some. The fact that it has lower air pollution is a different motivating factor for a different group. The fact that the performance and noise levels, etc. So it will just really depend on who, I guess, we're trying to target to then framing the messaging appropriately to that group and then ensuring that the spokesperson or the messenger will resonate with that group. I think that's more important.
Thanks, Jo. I've got our last question here for today that I think we're going to have time for, and that has come through from Jeremy. And it is, do we think that the high uptake of recycling may be a misleading representation of people caring or being willing to take climate action due to how easily accessible it is? Especially in comparison with EV buying, for example.
Yeah, it is easily accessible, and it's a very easy thing to do. So of course, you know, people do it to some degree and say they do it. I guess probably the more interesting thing for me on that one is how many people think it's a very strong climate change action when there's so many stronger ones that people can take. You know, recycling doesn't really help climate change that much. So I think it's a lot of this is being able to let people know what climate change actions do make a difference, because we know that they don't really know.
Thank you, Karen. So unfortunately, it's time for us to wrap things up for today. It's great to have had such a fantastic discussion at the end as well. So thank you everyone for the engagement and the quality of your questions. A reminder that we are making the raw data and research fully available on the evidence and insights section of our EECA website. So do go in and have a look around. You might find some other bits and pieces there that interest you as well. A huge thank you to TRA for your mahi in carrying out this deep dive, but also in pulling this awesome presentation together. And I also want to thank each and every one of you for attending. As Joe said, it really is fantastic to see so much interest in this. We've been really heartened. I'm going to finish with a beautiful whakato that some of you will no doubt be familiar with. Ka ora a papatuanuku, ka ora te tangata. When the earth is well, the people will be well. Thank you.